Hey, we're back. This is what did I call this? Proxygate. I think that's what the podcast title was called, but I don't think it really matters. What does matter is I'm just here with Mizenhauer, gonna talk some bullshit about StarCraft 2, and this time I've got three topics in mind. I can go really anywhere with this. I'm pretty loose about this kind of stuff, so. The three topics I had in mind were the GSL, the Super Tournament, and then the who is the greatest GSL player. And we'll save the third one for last because I think that's the most interesting topic personally. So start with the GSL because in terms of dates, it finished first. Right. So in this one, Mario wins his fourth back to back to back to back. Right.
Correct.
And
And yeah, as it's over the course of I think this one started a little late, but I think it ended around the same time. So it's like 12 months of just crushing people in Korea,
mm-hmm.
which is pretty crazy. I mean, I don't think any of his playoff matches were particularly close.
No, none of them were close this time. His some of his other runs had some close run-ins, but this one was basically just a stomp throughout.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I think the more interesting story was of course Classic. We'll get into more, but his semifinal versus Dark was actually a kind of cool match where Classic did all kinds of weird stuff against this is like where the Korean pros would be like, oh, he's younger, he's faster, he's whatever than me, and Classic just is the wily vet who pulls out his tricks and wins.
Yeah, so let's go with that one because basically, for those who don't know, Classic's gonna retire soon, right? Like I don't know if he announced it, but he must have
I
announced it
think,
if everybody's talking about it. Actually,
yeah, I think he said at the end of this year he's going to do military.
yeah. So this is actually kind of I don't know if you were around for this, but basically this is very similar to what Curious did
Hmm.
in some DreamHack, I think, where basically he said, "Yeah, this is it, I'm done," and then he goes to DreamHack and he wins it. And he's like, "Wait, maybe I'm still good," and then he kept playing for like another 2 years being bad, but the this but in Classic's case, I'm pretty sure, unlike Curious, he's actually accomplished so much in his career already that he's probably just done after this year. Because like, there's no like what ifs with Classic. He's already done.
Yeah.
He's already won so much. He's already done so much in Korea, and he's already gonna go down as one of the best Protosses. So, what's interesting? Here's how I classify the. I think the Classic Dark series is pretty interesting, but here's how I generally classify it: is basically like Classic is really smart, but he doesn't have a stylized play style.
Hmm.
And so what he does is he has like a broad set of tools, and then he just kind of counterpunches whoever he's playing against. That's kind of how I describe Classic. And as like the years have gone on, like his personal mechanics and his execution has like fallen off bit by bit. Whether that's due to his motivation, his age, or the fact that he's out of the Kespa system is up for debate. But basically, he's leaned more and more and more on his intelligence and series prep and that stuff rather than trying to out execute whatever opponent he's been running into for the last few years. What do you think about Classic?
I mean, Classic was always, you go way back to like 2014, and people were talking about Classic being really good at preparing for series.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, kind of persisted throughout. He's been, last 2 years, he's been pretty good. Like, he didn't do like 2016 was not great. 2017, really, okay. But 2018, did well. So far this year, he's done well. So he's found ways to cope with the changing times. Like you said, he doesn't have like a particular style. His identity has a lot to do with versatility. I think that's allowed him to keep going. 5 years after he won the Codas, it
Mm-hmm.
was June of 2014.
Yeah. And so basically, people set this up. So what's interesting about the finals is that's basically a rematch, if you want to think about it. But the timeline is so different from the last time they played because the last time they played was in the GSL semifinals. I think it was in 2014, and that
Oh, I mean, they played in the semifinals of Codas last
yeah
year.
last year.
Yeah, last year 2018.
But I think I'm pretty sure. The reason I remember the one in 2014 is because that's the one where Classic like smashed Maru.
Hmm.
Whereas in 2018, I'm almost certain like Mario Smash Classic. I don't think that
Yeah,
one was close,
that
right?
was another not really close series.
Yeah,
That was when Mario beat Zest 4-0 right after that.
yeah. And basically, the reason I remember that one is because at that time, Classic was mechanically a far better player than he is now.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is if you're looking at the skill relative to Mario now or Mario back then, I don't think there's that much of a difference. Like, I'd agree that Mario expanded his game. I think mechanically he's pretty. Actually, mechanically he might have been even better back then than he is now. But relative to his peers, he's probably better now than back then. If
Hmm.
you kind of get what I'm
I
going with
understand
that,
it. A
right?
general trend for the whole
Yeah.
scene.
hmm And so what was interesting about back then was he wasn't able to enforce his style, whereas in the last two run-ins in this post Kespa era, he's basically just smashed Classic pretty fucking hard both times they've met up.
Yeah,
And
I think I got.
yeah, basically it's like Classic might be smart, but like he can't outsmart Mario in this particular era, and there are a few reasons as to why I think that is, but I think part of it is because of just how this game is different from now to back then.
Hmm. Well, I think so. It's actually funny when you go back to that season in 2018 and look at the results that surround their meetings. So in 2018, Classic had just beaten Beyond 3-0 in the quarters, and then he loses 4-1 to Classic. I mean, he loses 4-1 to Mario in semis. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bracket, Zest wins a very close series 4-3 against UI, and then
Mm-hmm.
loses 0-4 to Mario. And one would have to look at this year where same thing, Mario 3-1 steer, 4-0's trap. Classic, got, as we'll get to after this super tournament, he does well against Terran. We'll see. But Mario is kind of just like fighting against a tide that all the other Terrans are really struggling against
Mm-hmm.
for the past 2 years. And it's funny how Classic and Mario pop up as common names in this storyline.
Yeah, there there is something to be said. I don't know how deep you want to go into Mario's history, but basically Mario was one of like if you're going back if you're trying to like contextualize Mario versus Protoss, I'd say his peak was probably in actually besides now. I actually think his peak is now technically,
Yeah.
but his other peak before then that was incredibly impressive. I think was late 2013 to early 2014. And the reason I think that particular era was very impressive is because that was the Blink era.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically the era where like Blink Stalkers were I don't necessarily call them overpowered, but in terms of the strategies, the builds, and the mothership core, and the vision and the mechanics involved with all the players there within, basically Protoss just fucking smashed Terran all day, every day. And the only I think there were only like three legitimate Terrans who could actually beat top Protosses at the time. One of them was Tasia, who I think could just out decision make Protoss, so he could like absorb that pressure and then get to the mid to late game and win there. Second one was Pult. Pult pulled out a freakish like ESL Cologne run where he beat Rain, and he basically like he was always a mechanically inferior player, and it's particularly in that era compared to like top Korean players or even the top foreigners. But he basically used a bunch of tactics to run his opponents around. And the third one is Maru, and Maru is the most interesting because he's actually if you're talking about innovators, he's technically the guy who created Marine, Marauder, Medevac, Widowmine into Protoss. Like no other Terran besides him tried to do this before the Widowmine buff because they all thought it was complete waste of time because it just didn't do a lot of damage. But what was interesting about Mario is he pulled that off, and the only reason he was allowed to pull it off compared to the other Terrans is because mechanically he was far superior to them. And what I mean by that is not just the stutter stepping and the aiming with the Widow Mines, because you have to selectively aim where you want to throw them out if you want to do the maximum amount of damage, and that's basically something most Terrans didn't even bother doing. And I don't think most Terrans even do that to this day, to be honest. And then the last thing he did, which is incredibly rare and I've never seen it, is because of the way charge worked back then, it locks onto the first target, and then the zealots always run towards that first target. And what Mario did was he could recognize what that first target was and then pull that one all the way back while stutter stepping with the rest. So he did massive amounts of more damage compared to other Terrans. And that's kind of always been Mario's strength, is he gets more out of his small unit engagements. He gets more out of his out of the mid game. He actually gets more out of the late game too, just off of his raw mechanics and micro basically. And so that's, if we're going to point out to a reason as to why he's kicking Protoss ass and none of the other Terrans are, I'd say that's part of the reason. And the other part of the reason is because I think he is defining the paradigm of how Terran, I won't say should be played, but how he plays it into Protoss.
Yeah, when you go back to 2014, which is the period you're talking about, people who complain about balance now probably don't remember how there were 4 Terrans in Code S in Season 2 of 2014, and only 2 of them made the round of 16, and Maru was the only Terran in Seasons 1 or 2 to make the round of 8. He made the round of 8 in both seasons. That's kind of when he earned this like fourth race nickname, because he was the only Terran who wasn't just getting demolished by every Protoss. His trademark was like, you think of like a game on Outbox or the Pro League map, where he'd be microing his Marauders against a bunch of Colossi and like splitting the Marauders, so each Colossi is only attacking one Marauder, and it's just kind of like cartoonishly skillful stuff that he'd be pulling off that like no one else could do. Like you talked about getting the most out of his units, and I think it's funny because this is a good example of how players become caricatures in a way.
Yeah.
We like pick an identity for them and we assign it, and that's what they'll be. Like Maru is the micro guy, Innovation is the macro guy, TY is the smart guy. And I think a lot of time it just comes down to like, to be a player who's as good as Maru. I mean, even back then or now, you have to have the whole package. I think Maru, you talk about playing this Widowmine style. You can't play a style like the Widowmine style in 2015 and 14 without just having perfect production, because you're just throwing away Widowmines. Like he used to do I think one of the matches in GSL he did it too. He's like 4 Widowmine drop, 4 Widowmine drop, 4 Widowmine drop, just over and over. And if you see somebody do this on ladder, they're going to just get stomped by a counterattack. But Maru somehow has this big army that easily handles whatever the Protoss has left after all the harassment. So I think Maru's, you talk about, trademarks, has always been the ability to never skip production while harassing and get the most out of his units while just making more stuff than everybody else. And so you talk about PVT in 2018, it was a lot of proxy stuff, but now it's gone back to just Maru harassing and just making more stuff. He seems to understand the matchup better than other Terrans.
Yeah.
Come the Super Tournament, so we kind of saw a different take on Terran. He used it against stats, and Gumiho used it throughout the tournament as this new
mech
battle mech, which was formerly reserved just for Zergs, but now is being used against Protoss.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that, besides who won the tournament, I think battle mech was one of the stories of the Super Tournament for sure.
Yeah, we may as well just transition over. I guess I'll add one more thing about Maru, is if I did look through all of his games for this GSL run. I mean, basically he has the same problem now as he does back then, but the difference between now and back then is like very few players can actually get him to this point, which is basically, if you can somehow beat Maru in the early game or mid game and then take the tempo control of the match, it's not that he's bad at making comebacks, it's that he's not as good at making comebacks compared to like some of the top best players. And so he finds it hard, like he's way stronger at snowballing a game than he is at making a comeback in a game. So if that's technically a way you could beat Maru, the problem is like mid game and early game is it's his playground. Like I don't outside of TBT, I don't think anybody can technically really match him in those areas. So yeah, go ahead.
I think Maru has always been very, very smart in the sense of like good preparation, good game plan. He knows what to do, knows how to execute. But yeah, when you get to like weird kind of like remember when you played SOS
Yeah,
BlizzCon, he gets cannon rushed and
he has no
he
answer.
lifts off he lifts off his base, which was like the right thing to do when you're trying to get cannon rushed. But he landed it at the what would have been his third base, one of the two third base locations, which is directly below his main base. And SOS could just like park a unit on the cliff and just like shoot the mineral line.
Yeah,
It's like a situation like this kind of thing where it's like an abstract scenario,
thinking on your
thinking
feet.
off the top of your head, not able to revert back to the game plan that you installed. Yeah, he struggles in those kind of situations. So I know what you mean when you say once he gets behind, he can catch up through mechanics. He can like take better trades all the time, but at a certain point, even that's not going to get you there.
Yeah, and I only call this a relative weakness because I don't think there are very many players. First off, that can force that situation left. Like there weren't even that many players like in the apex of like a shit ton of Koreans and foreigners and whatever. But even now, like I don't think very many players can force that situation, and I don't even think that many players could capitalize on the situation that well either. Like this is also like a problem like Zest has, but like Zest back, but Zest has so many other problems that we don't really see that one come about
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, exactly. It's gotten to that point.
Yeah, so that's just something interesting to know because if Mario does fall off, it's probably going to be because a player is able to force that kind of situation on him, or I think the only other way you technically beat Mario is if a meta switches to a very not very mechanical, actually very mechanical macro based ZVT, and then I'll go ahead and say and like heavy mid game to early late game ZVT, like basically a Muta Ling Baneling style. If that ever came back, I actually think Sue can still beat Mario in that situation, but that's
Yeah,
like a very specific situation. So
if you go back to Heart of the Swarm, Maru, yeah, wasn't the best at TVZ.
yeah, like if
Obviously good, but like compare innovations, TVZ was like so
yeah,
far ahead of
yeah,
Maru.
innovations is better, and then like
Dreams was better for a time too.
Dreams hit the apex. I argue Teja's was probably better, at least theoretically. Maybe not in micro battle micro, but in terms of theory, he was probably better. So yeah. All right, moving on to the super tournament. I actually think there's only like, well, I think there's only like three things to talk about here. It's generally like Gumiho's run, classic beating Gumiho, and then like the mech Terran style.
I think the fourth would just be the makeup of the tournament being
A billion Protosses.
very Protoss heavy.
All right. So why do you think there's a billion Protosses in this one?
Well, let me double check qualifiers. So like the people you'd be concerned about, maybe like Hurricane, right? Hurricane random Protoss. He beat TY to qualify. Parting random Protoss beat Innovation to qualify. So we're starting to see this trend of more accomplished players losing. Parting's accomplished, but in last
He's not accomplished anymore, man. Like, come on.
It will be a decade at this point. Parting hasn't had a relevant result in a while, but yeah, it's more accomplished Terrans losing to inferior Protosses. In the qualifying match meant that if just those two guys win, if Innovation and TY win, then suddenly we have 7 Protoss for Terran, 5 Zerg, so more fair. But instead we get like this 9 Protoss thing where all the Zergs lose their opening matchups. The most surprising one, probably Hurricane 3-1 Rogue with 3 timing attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Gumiho beats Dark, which was a good match. I think that was probably one of the matches people most look forward to in that round.
Yeah.
And yeah, you get 7 Protoss quarterfinal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but regarding Gumiho, because you mentioned him, really cool tournament from him for sure, showing the battle mech thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like I highly doubt it's a long-term solution to the matchup.
No, I think both Maru and I don't know about Maru. Like Maru's always been willing to like experiment weird shit. in
Gumiho
general.
lives in weird shit.
I
That's
mean,
like
he
his
lives with SOS,
sense
so
of
I guess what do you want me to say, right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
for all he knows, like this is like the most standard game I've played in the last 8 years. Like maybe that's what Mario thinks when he was playing that
yeah.
mech game. Um, but Gumiho, he's certainly like Gumiho is a unique player, but like he's technically never made an innovation in his life in the sense that almost none of the stuff he's ever done has like caught on to the mainstream.
No, no, and like it did show. I mean, when Gumiho generally there was the one Code S season where he beat Maru in the semis, which is a big win for him.
Hmm.
But yeah, he beat Sue in the finals, so that only matters so much. Lost to Sue at BlizzCon that year, and then it's been pretty quiet since. But you saw when he played against Classic. Funny, Classic's the old man, but Gumiho was just painfully slow to react in a lot of situations. He's never been a great multitasker. That's never been his strength. But yeah, he really looked just outclassed in that department when he played against Classic.
Hmm. So what's interesting about this entire run from Gumiho basically is I guess it's in within context of when Maru played stats, right? Because basically when Maru played stats, I'd say like I think Game 4 is probably the apex of that entire series, where like both of them really went all out. Both of them played at like a very end game, very scrappy, very smart. It's a very like generally in other scrappy games, like people are just trying to survive. In this game, it was pretty calculated aggression for both sides. Like, oh, if I do this, then he'll do this. But if I do that, then I'll get economic advantage here, or a unit advantage, or a positional advantage. Like basically, they were thinking like 2 or 3 steps ahead each time. They were making their aggressive moves, and they made sense within the context of the information they had on the map, right? And what's interesting is basically if I had to pin it down, Maru was willing to play a standard style of mech into stats. And if you do that, basically, I still contest to this day, mech was always trash against Protoss. It was always trash against Protoss. And there are a lot of different reasons why, but basically Protoss has too many different answers or too many different styles of beating it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're like a truly like even though both of us agree there's technically never been a true perfect Protoss, but if such Protoss existed, like you couldn't beat them with mech because wouldn't really matter what kind of player you were. Like they could figure out the specific style it takes to beat your style of mech or whatever.
Do you recall? Speaking of Protoss versus mech, do you recall when I think it was Byung played against Classic in Pro League and mech versus him on Outboxer?
I remember them playing. I remember Byung being one of those guys who did play mech, but I don't remember the Outboxer match.
So there's this really funny. So you talk about the perfect Protoss because we might have had a perfect Protoss who retired.
Yeah.
The closest thing we ever had to a perfect Protoss already retired.
Yeah.
So Classic plays against Byung and he just doesn't scout and he just gets mech. He dies to mech on Outboxer. So it was Pro League, so it's like best of 3. So the next day they played again. It was the playoffs. And this time it was Byung versus Rain. And Byung goes for the exact same build against Rain. Same map, same build, and Rain just actually responds correctly and just destroys it. It's not even close.
Yeah, that does sound exactly like something I'd imagine given how you set that up. Yeah, Rain was as close to Protoss as I ever saw. Yeah. But basically here's the problem basically of running this experiment is I don't think stats is actually a perfect Protoss. So basically Mario played a style that was actually into stats' wheelhouse in terms of mech. And then here's what Gumiho did. Gumiho was like, well, if I just create enough chaos, like odd timings or a lot of like even though I completely agree with you when you say like his multitasking is crap. Well, you didn't go that far, but I'll go that far. Gumiho's like multitasking is crap. Like his trick is it's not that I can multitask at all. It's that I can create so much chaos across the map that I will diminish your ability to multitask with me, and then hopefully the differential between what I'm doing and what you're doing is in my favor. It's kind of like how Gumiho has always played StarCraft, right? Because he kind of understands that if you went into like a 1v1 situation or like a Beyond type situation where like you're literally only doing like one battle at a time, then he's always going to lose. So even though it's technically his weakness, he's kind of has a bigger weakness, so he has to use his his like better weakness to cover his like greatest weakness or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, I mean, his decision making is generally pretty good. It just so he like knows when he gets into those scrappy situations, his decision making of where to focus, where to put the emphasis on, where to apply pressure, or how to do so, is usually pretty spot on. It's just sometimes when there's a lot of stuff going on, his ability to execute is the weakness, not the ability to
Not the actual ideas.
yeah, the ideas are there, but like you saw, I think Wax was mentioning one situation where like one Archon kills a bunch of Banshees because Gumiho's just not paying attention.
Yeah,
He's too busy doing other stuff.
Yeah, that's Gumiho in a nutshell. Like,
But so one other thing is interesting is you talk about Gumiho and not making any real innovations because I think a lot of Gumiho styles like exclusive to him. When he plays the battle mech style, he plays it differently than
Maru.
Yeah. Do you think Year Zero is a perfect example? Gumiho loves to go battle cruisers on Year Zero, be it against he did it against Cyril, he did it against Classic. Obviously, that's the first one's a different matchup, but he sees that as like a map where he can comfortably get into the late game. But when Maru played stats on Year Zero, it was Maru he just didn't. I don't think he felt comfortable going into the late game for stats on that map. He kept it low tier. It kind of reminded me of like keeping it on layer tech the whole game, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like we're gonna keep it just a
tier
constant
2
aggression. No, yeah, exactly. We're never gonna tech up. We're never gonna be passive. And I think, so it shows like a difference of how the two play the same style, even though it's it's different interpretations.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I think Gumiho actually goes on. It's not because I think Gumiho is an actually better mech player, or even had a better day on the better tournament or whatever. I just think his style matches up against the Protoss players he ran into first. Like if he runs into Classic, I think Classic tears him apart early on.
Yeah. Well, he did. I mean, yeah, that was not a close series. I think against stats, Gumiho only did the mech thing once out of the 3 games.
Yeah.
The series against Parting, I think he could have played, with one hand and probably beat Parting.
Yeah, Parting's just bad. Like Parting's like one of my favorite players, but he's just bad.
Let's just remember that Parting beat Ragnarok and Hurricane to make the semifinals.
Yeah, those two are also equally bad or worse.
Yeah, so Parting probably. I mean, if Parting, it's funny because you look at like transitive properties and it doesn't really work in StarCraft much, but like Parting reverse. I think he reverse swept Ragnarok.
Yeah.
So you think like, he crushed Hurricane, but like Hurricane beat Rogue, but you figure Rogue would have to beat Parting, but maybe Parting just does 4 timing attacks and kills Rogue just like Hurricane.
I'm almost certain Parting would just do timing attacks if he's smart, because he knows he's not a good player, right?
It worked for Hurricane, so I think it would have worked for Parting too.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was definitely, that upper bracket was pretty crazy.
It was pretty messy.
A lot of weird stuff happening. Lower bracket was, I think Zest always beats Deer. SOS versus Solar is like, who knows? Sue Classic, that's pretty predictable. Classic's playing well, Sue's not. I think the bottom half of the bracket was pretty much.
Yeah, then it goes like PvP, but like I think Classic was the best of all of them, PvP wise anyway, so he should have gone out.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's hard to figure out, like, I don't buy into this, like, who the best is at PvP, because I think a lot of it is just, like,
luck.
The time. Like, some players are good, some players are not. I mean, especially, like, now, like, Zest beats Deer in PvP, but Zest always beats Deer in PvP.
All right.
And Hero versus Patience is like, I mean, that's... It's hard to read too much because they could play 10 times and have like a different result every time. You know?
Right. PvP is like it's random, but like there's technically logic to it. But here's the thing about PvP is if you get a mental edge, you can always beat the other guy. And what I mean by mental edge is like what you're basically talking about here is like Zest will always beat Deer, and we're not just talking about like this patch or within this year. I think he's historically always beaten Deer, or like a shit ton of times.
It's not close. Their matchup. I mean, if the Liga lock doesn't take forever to load as it's wont to do, I can give you the exact number, but it's not close, if I recall.
Yeah, and basically this is something that's kind of it becomes a lot more clear if you ignore the fact that every game is different. Because I think PvP, even though the builds change, the units change, the meta changes, at the end of the day, it is a shit ton of mind games. And so some people's styles beat other people's styles, or some people have a much better read of how a certain player plays, and therefore they can always abuse that or predict what they're going to do. This is also why I think like Zest. This is also the reason I think Zest was so dominant in this particular matchup in 2014, was because he actually had the best understanding of the game, and if you have the best understanding of the game, then you don't actually need to go get stuck in the fucking mind games of what generally PvP usually is. So that's why he got away with it. And that's generally what you see with the best Protosses within each respective period is they either they have the best understanding or they have some kind of definitive edge in the meta that allows them to beat the others without. And that definitive edge is almost never the mind game. It's always something else that lets them avoid the mind game. Like when MC was the best, it's because he understood force fields. Therefore, guess what? Everybody only played 4-gate. If you're the best force fielder or you're the best microer, you're always going to win 4-gate. So like this entire like situation always keeps happening as you go forward, basically for PvP.
Yeah. And for the record, I think PvP is a pretty fun matchup. I think it's been one of the better matchups I used to avoid for a while. But I don't think it's been as much like one. I don't think there's been one guy on top for
forever.
Very long.
Like I think last time was like basically Rain or Zest. I guess Zest would be the last guy who could truly dominate PvP, and that was like 5 years ago now.
By the way, Zest is 14-4 against your lifetime.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all. Like just in terms of, like actually I don't know. I'd have to go through the VODs to check exactly what the fuck Zest is doing, but you're always going to get certain matchups where like somebody can fuck somebody else really badly just based off of psychological momentum and the fact that maybe their styles or whatever. Like this basically happened to like Marine King and MVP. It happened for a long time with Maru and Parting before Parting became shit. So, but
you know how game scores are usually a lot closer than match scores because there's like a lot of 2-1s and stuff. So like 14-4 is so Deer's win percentage against Zest is 22%. But in games, he's still losing 30-11. So he gets like 2-0'd or 3-0'd or whatever it is a lot.
Oh, that's really bad.
Yeah, it's really bad. Generally, your game percentage is much closer than the match, but no, he just gets. If you go through, I mean, it's not a pretty picture.
All right, so I think about covers it for Super Tournament and GSL. Was there anything else you want to talk about in those particular?
No, I think that's good. There's actually some interesting stuff that we alluded to already that will come up in the next discussion.
All right, so we may as well go to the final one because Mizenhauer here wrote an article on Team Liquid basically proclaiming, and I think it's perfectly fair, basically saying Mario is the greatest GSL player of all time, right? Or something along those lines, right? Yeah. And what's interesting is he decided to use the MVP example, and what's strange is like, even though I'm technically the MVP advocate, I don't actually think he's the best GSL player of all time. I thought Sue was. Right, but we may as well start getting into that. I guess we'll start. Do you want to start with the MVP thing first, or why I don't think he's like second in this particular discussion?
Yeah,
or...
I'm curious. I'm curious to hear why.
Right, so there are a few reasons. First, when we're talking about the raw like number of competitors he's played in the era he played in, so he basically plays from 2011 to 2012 in the GSL period, right? But what's weird is like you can't really count his IEM world, not IEM, but his GSL World Championship, and
Super Tournament.
It's now called the Super Tournament, but back then it was like called the World Championship or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But it's on the same level.
It's on the same level, but basically the reason you can't count it is because in terms of format, it's completely incompatible compared to the GSL. GSL runs for like back then it was like a month. Now it's like multiple months. I think it's multiple months, and there's only a playoffs in the World Championship, whereas there's no group stage. And what's interesting about MVP in that particular tournament, I guess, in terms of perception, is his haters will be like, yeah, that one doesn't count. Whereas like his fans will just pretend it's a real GSL. In actuality, it's kind of in between, as in like the 3 players he played were all legitimately really good players at the time. So in that sense, it counts, but it's not as prestigious as a GSL. And for that reason, you have to strike it off because it's not technically a true GSL. It's the same reason, for instance, right? Here's my reason I don't count it. Is I don't think anybody has ever counted Sue's Kespa Cup as a GSL.
No. Well, for the purposes of the article, I think we were saying the point I was trying to make is that when I say GSL player, I'm more talking about Codas. Really, is the
Yeah.
But that's where it matters. Like if you look at GSL, like Hero is the GSL champion, but Codas being Codas champion is a whole different.
Yeah, that's like a whole more prestigious thing, right? And so that takes out care of that part because that's obviously not an argument you made at all, but it's just something I have to point out first. So you take that out of the way. So he's not really a 4-time; he's really just a 3-time, right?
But if I recall, he made how many? He lost to Life in one final.
He lost to Life in one final, yeah, and then he lost to MMA in another final.
So he did make, however, he only won what? He only won 3, but he made 5 finals.
Yeah, he made 3, but lost 2. That's kind of his thing, right?
Yeah.
And now here we go to the other parts. Is I think format-wise, the GSL doesn't solidify until the end of 2011, and so if you look at the earlier ones, yeah, his path to the in some of them, his path to the top was pretty fucking legit. Like he played basically all the best players in one of them, but a lot of the times it was just best of ones.
Yeah,
and so
there are a couple problems with early GSL.
Yeah, so
the best one also, but I'm sure you'll be able to talk more about it because I don't know exactly when they changed it, but you used to get the Codas didn't change much.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah, basically it was done for cynical reasons. Basically, the idea was, well, if you changed the GSL a lot back then, the scene was so unsteady that they assumed, and I think correctly, that if you ran a bunch of qualifiers, the names would change too fast in GSL to create a proper narrative or whatever. I think that was the reasoning. And so basically what happens is you get a bunch of bums a lot of the times. And so if you want to rate somebody's GSL run back from back then, not only do you have the format problems, but you also have to figure out who the fuck they were playing and if that guy was actually good at that time. Because a lot of them weren't. A lot of them were just like hanger-ongers who was like, well, I lost this match, but I will practice for my up and down match, and then I won't do anything or some bullshit like that. It happened a lot.
There were a lot of people who stayed in Codas that
didn't deserve to be there.
Had the qualifiers been different, they would have not made it. But yeah, they were able to automatically go to the up and down match, and then play somebody from Code A who wasn't as good. So yeah, MVP kind of existed in this era where best of one, and also people, Codas was filled with a lot of just filler. Yeah.
So basically, that's one of the reasons why I never really had him as like he's still in the top 3. Like, don't get me wrong, but like as one of the knocks against him, basically, it's like it just happened to play in a bad era where like they had a bad format. So that's another reason I was against him. And then finally we got to like some really like very specific contextual stuff as to why he's above certain other players. So if you're looking at if you're basically looking at his run, right? He beats Top. I think he beats Marine King. He beats Squirtle. He loses to MMA and he loses to Life. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way I see it is among all of them are pretty legit runs, but if you want to talk about meta and patches and stuff, because this is, I'm not sure how you think about this or how other people think about this, but I think you have to include the contextual meta and then kind of apply that in terms of difficulty, because StarCraft 2 is an asymmetrical strategy game. So if a particular race is stronger than another race, and this was the case in MVP's earlier runs where Terran was the strongest, then it kind of counts against them, or it's like something you have to consider. And so
exactly. StarCraft is only as hard as what you're playing.
Yeah. So basically, And what's weird about MVP is he has a very similar problem to Maru. If we're talking about this particular problem, because like Maru, he was technically the innovator. He did all these builds that made Terran the strongest, or he took builds like other people did, like Jinro, and then refined them to the point where they became the strongest. So it kind of evens out to the same thing. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, yeah, Terran was the strongest, but it was largely because of him. Like, how much do you knock off of that because technically he was the one who made it strongest or whatever? But it's a very hard thing to distinguish, but it is worth noting, because the reason it's worth noting is why he will always be like the conversation for greatest of all time. As to whether or not he's number one or not is up for debate, but basically the reason he's always been in the conversation for all time is because of his last 2 GSL final runs, or basically he's like half dead. He's got like 5 slip discs or whatever. But what makes those 2 runs better, in my opinion, than his previous 3 runs, or I guess the MMA run isn't actually as bad, because even though Terran was stronger, I think there was a shift definitely towards more of an even keel meta at that point in that time period. It's arguable, but I think it was there. But in terms of the other 2, I think Terran was weaker in the other 2 for certain. Like, absolutely for certain, 100% in the Broodlord and Fester era. But specifically in MVP's case, it was like he happened to hit GSL playoffs right in like the 1 to 2 month span when all of Protoss was like overpowered in the terms of meta, not in terms of balance. And the difference between meta and balance is a balance came from David Kim to say this unit is the strongest, whereas meta comes from the players. Like, they figured out a shit ton of different things that made them really good.
Yep.
And so he basically runs into a very Protoss heavy meta. And then Protoss PVT was specifically MVP's worst matchup. Like, among his 3 matchups, that was by far his worst. And the fact that he not only beats, in my opinion, the 3 best Protosses at a time, Naniwa, Parting, or Squirtle, not only does he beat all 3 of them, but all 3 of them were in the same team house. So all 3 of them were sharing data and sharing information each time they lost to him. Mm-hmm. And not only did that happen, but they're also playing in a meta specific where all the Protosses were creating a bunch of like really good stuff, specifically against Terran, but also against Zerg. And Squirtle was at the forefront of that. Parting was at the forefront of that. Naniwa was at the forefront of that. And then Naniwa was arguably the best Protoss foreigners had ever seen. Certainly by that point, but I'd argue you can even make an argument for all time. Maybe I think he was better than Neeb. I think he was better than Little Bow. I think go to Parting. Parting was playing the best PVT at the time. Squirtle was the best Protoss at the time. And you put all that together, and then you also put the fact that like Squirtle had yet to become a Kong, and this is a very subtle point, but basically I don't think people are born Kongs. I think you lose too many finals and then you become a Kong. And that's kind of what happens with Squirtle, because Squirtle only has 1 final before this. It's at IPL 4 or IPL 3, I forget the exact number. But basically he plays a like 16-hour day, and he's like these epic long series throughout the losers bracket. And then he makes it to a live. And what's weird about this tournament is he has to, in order for Squirtle to win, he has to win 2 best of 5s against Alive. And Alive was in the upper bracket the entire time, just chilling. And he actually pulls it all the way to reset the bracket before he loses. So basically at that point, he's been running like 18 hours of high intensity StarCraft, and then he loses. So in my opinion, that's not an actual choke. That's just him running out of energy. Like, yeah. Right? And then you look at the actual way these series played out. If Squirtle was a true choker, he would have just lost 4-0 right after MVP beat him in the first 3. But he didn't. He goes 3-3, and then he beats the MVP's all-in, and then he loses to MVP's all-in because he didn't see it coming. And I actually went through like an entire like fucking article explaining how like that was actually just MVP psychologically jailbreaking Squirtle's mind, because Squirtle, being at the forefront of Protoss meta knowledge at the time, basically the way he dealt with all-ins was he tried to get a lot of information and then basically play like a transitional defense. So if you send out a stalker and you scout out the areas for all the areas, if your stalker runs into a bunch of Marines, then you can slowly kite them back over and over and over again. But because MVP used this on the game point, and because of the way the architecture of the map was worked, MVP was able to abuse this fact and then ambush his lone stalker or whatever, and then basically run it all the way to the end, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons as to why MVP is still in this conversation. The other one, obviously, is I'm not gonna go that in detail, but basically, like, it was fucking life. It's fucking Ruler and Fester. Like, I don't know if I need to go that deep into it.
No, I mean, it's, yeah.
Right. And
so,
like,
you gotta tell me why Sue is better than.
But here's why Sue is actually better, right? So you compare that, right? I think compare Sue. Basically, Sue has, let me count it real quick. He has 6 second places, and I think he has a top 4 too. Right?
Oh, yeah, he lost to Stats last year.
Right.
In Season 1. So
if we're looking at the competition between 2017 to 2018, 2019 to 2011 and 2012, right? I'd say you have more competition back then, but in terms of like refinement and overall knowledge it's kind of similar-ish. So like it really depends on who you're playing against. And what makes this particular thing interesting for me is basically Sue is in a very similar position if you're talking about his 2018 years to MVP's 2012 year, I guess. That's kind of how I put it, is like he's clearly on the decline. Like, he really shouldn't have been able to make a comeback, but he did. Right? Mm-hmm. And so you add then, and he does it not only once, but he does it twice. Mm-hmm. So I think that's impressive in and of itself. I also think the fact that the format changes are better now to back then kind of equalizes the relative fact that there's more competition there.
Yeah. I think it's funny when you talk about Sue, Maru, and MVP, who existed in 3 completely different eras of Codas.
Mm-hmm.
As you said about MVP, we talked about early Codas format, current Codas, where there's literally, if you're a good player, you're automatically in Codas. You're just not going to lose in the qualifiers. You get 2 tries to qualify. There's only it's very obvious. If your name is Maru, your name is Sue, you're going to make the round of 32, no problem. And then Maru also enjoys the benefit of getting the first pick in the draft for the round of 16, which honestly has been hit or miss. A lot of people hasn't guaranteed anything, but Maru's been really good at making himself an easy group.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, 2013, 2014, which is Sue's time, and I think this is the biggest thing Sue is going for him, is the competitiveness of that era. I looked at a tournament, the Hot Six Cup in 2014 actually had 8 16-man brackets for its qualifiers.
Just to get in.
8 16. I mean, it's absurd how many people were playing competitive StarCraft back then. And yeah, so Sue, having succeeded in that era, made the 4 straight finals, is very impressive. I would argue, if you just said making 4 straight finals then or making 4 straight finals now, which is more impressive, I think then.
Yeah.
For sure. Winning them I think my argument was that winning them tilts the whole thing
into Maru's favor, right?
Because, I think if you ignore the result of the finals, I think Sue is definitely the best GSL player. I mean, he did it in 2 separate eras. He did it in very different ways.
Yeah.
But Maru winning them is kind of just like no one's been as good at winning Korean leagues as Maru.
Yeah, but here's my problem, I guess, is technically Maru was in the same era as Sue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he this is something I guess innovation fans have always hated me for, if they ever bothered looking at the arguments I was making. But basically, from those periods, end of 2013, 2014 to 2015, I've always said I thought Maru was the better player than Innovation across that time period as a Terran player.
To be fair, Maru was the better player in every season but season 3 of those years.
Yeah. So that's why I think, like, well, if you're better in 2 out of the 3 seasons, you're actually a better player, right? That was always my argument, basically.
Yeah, Maru was better than him in the first 2 seasons, 2014, 2015. 2014 season 3, Innovation wins.
Yeah.
Maru wins SSL in the beginning of the year, makes it to semifinals in season 3 of 15 and loses to Innovation. But I
Hmm.
agree with you. I think Innovation had 2 very good season 3s. But in general, during that time period, Mario was probably I think he
Yeah.
was the best Terran.
Yeah. So if you go with that logic, then which I personally did, like the only guy who I think technically could like usurp Maru was Teja, but like Teja is such a weird freak like anomaly that it's not like you could go either way with that one, so it's not worth going into. But the reason basically I have like Sue above both Maru and MVP is basically for the reasons you've stated. Basically, 2013, 2014 is by far the hardest period. And I don't just mean that in terms of the amount of players, but also the amount of infrastructure, the amount of motivation, and amount of discipline that was instituted by Kespa, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, it's because everybody it was because the amount of tournaments that was on play. Because you're basically playing GSL, you're playing Pro League, and you're playing in some specific cases a bunch of international tournaments.
Yeah. Like you talk about the final when Sue played Classic in the final, they had a Pro League match like 2 days later or something, or 2 days before, whatever it was.
Yeah. So,
And when Sue played Innovation, he had the Dream Hack against Solar like that,
mhm,
like a week
yeah.
away from it or whatever.
So I think if we're talking about if you add all that context in, basically I think this not only is this the hardest era in terms of competition, but in terms of player level, I think relative to basically the amount of refinement, I think is way harder in this period because, like I said, like for me, it's always about well, who did you beat along the way and how good were they, and this gets into a very weird subjective area because if I was comparing like Maru's runs to Sue's runs, like basically Maru's best runs are all now 2018, 2019. Sue's
Yep.
best runs are the 2013, 2014 period. MVP's best runs are late 2011 to the 2012 period, even though he was way more dominant before then.
Yep.
Right? And so when I compare these runs, I have to say, I think Sue basically played the hardest competition. Now, he didn't have the weirdest caveats because obviously MVP had like a bunch of weird caveats because he had like Brulor and Fester and he had like the 5 slip disc. I think he had to play all the Protosses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the fact that Sue not only did it longer because basically MVP only does it for like 2 seasons, 2 out of the 5 seasons.
Yep.
Sue does it for a year, like year and like 3 months, or in a year 4 months. I forget the exact timeline of this, but basically that's always been the reason why I favored Sue over both of these guys is because he does it in this hardest period, and he doesn't really have an advantage. Like, and he doesn't have like a self created advantage like either of them. What I mean by that is like if you look at Maru's GSL runs in 2018, yeah, I will give him credit for innovating a style or finding a style that basically made him invincible. The Raven style, right?
Yep.
I'll say the same for MVP for his 2011 runs. Sue did innovate a style. He did refine a style, but it didn't make him it didn't break the game, right? And so basically, he's playing
To be honest,
what?
Muta Corruptor was worse.
No, it was inferior. It was inferior by
It
far,
was
right?
worse. It just he could play it better than he could play the Stormhost.
Yeah, and that's always something I respected him for. But basically, if you're looking at Sue's runs here, right? He does he technically does the innovation and refinement as they do, but it just happens his patch doesn't benefit him as much as the patches did for Maru or they did for MVP. And so basically, when I look at his run, it's like a lesser version. It's like a slightly lesser version in terms of meta imbalance for compared to like the MVP runs. Like basically, he's like, well, he's technically fighting. He's technically not only fighting the hardest era, he's fighting against the meta. He's fighting against balance.
Yeah.
Right. Now you can argue as to whether or not as to whether or not it was because of his lack of skill that he couldn't play better Zerg styles, but I don't think basically it's like blaming somebody for not inventing like the Raven style before Maru. It's like it's not really conceivable. And basically the best style was technically the Snoot style. And that even that style, I'll go ahead and say it. Like people think it was overpowered, it wasn't overpowered. It's just boring. And not only was it boring, it just happened to be like no popular player was playing it, so you didn't get the Stefano effect. Mm-hmm. So I think that was at best like a 50-50 style, to be honest. It was like really execution heavy too. But basically, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think 2 interesting things about Sue's GSL in 2014. He only played 3 Terrans all year in the 3 seasons of Codex.
Mm-hmm.
So he played in season 1. He played Byung in the round of 16.
Yeah.
In season 2, he played who is it? I think he played no one.
And you didn't play anybody.
In 2014, he played Flash and Innovation in the third season.
Yeah.
He had
Yeah.
3 turns all year. So he was winning mirror matches and ZVPs. So like in season 3, for example, he beat Stats and Zest.
Mm-hmm.
He beat Stats and Zest in the elimination rounds. He beat Solar and True in season 2. Season 1's probably the most impressive, where he beats Party and Life.
Yeah.
And then loses to Zest 4-3. But like, yeah, it's pretty interesting how in a period when Zergs were actually doing pretty well against Terran, he just didn't play against Terrans. He just didn't play. Well, I think in Korea at least. But he just didn't play against. He didn't play against what's it called at all, Terran at all. He just won a lot of mirror matches, and beat like the best Protoss players in the world in quarter matches.
Yeah, but here's where here's the thing. Like obviously, that's also another reasons why I have like Sue above both of them. Is basically I think Protoss was by far the strongest in 2014.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're the Zerg player beating them is fucking impressive, in my opinion.
I view that as a compliment also. I mean, it's interesting that, when playing only 3 Terrans all year, I mean, he was mirror matches. The better player wins, right? I mean, there's no Ravens.
Especially in Zerg vs. Zerg. Like, better player always wins in Zerg vs. Zerg.
Yeah, exactly. So those are, him winning a lot of mirrors. I think he beat Life, he beat Sulky, he beat, like, everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so I think I gotta give it credit. So the reason I can admit that Sue a lot of elements of Sue's tournaments are more impressive. The only reason I personally said Maru is the biggest is because winning 4 finals. I mean, it's like
it's hard to deny, right? Like the number is so big.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at a certain point, like when it was 3, I was like willing to pose the question that this compares to what Sue's done, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Sue's big achievement was making the finals 4 times in a row, and now that Maru's won 4 times in a row, you start to say, well, how geez.
It's hard, like the number like really fucks with your minds. Like that number is so good, right? But here my other argument is, in his 2013 run and in his 2014 run, basically. He runs into the two best, I won't say the 2 best, but like 2 of the best Terran versus Zerg players in both runs. In 2013, he actually beats Innovation straight up, right? And then in 2014, like I know like basically all the Flash fans kind of just ignored this and erased it out of their minds. But every one of you was saying Flash was the literal best player in the world after he won Toronto. Flies back to Korea and gets his ass like destroyed by fucking Sue. Not only does he get like destroyed by Sue gives him 30 drones and he still beats the shit out of him. Like that's fucking ridiculous.
I mean, we can all accept Flash was not very good with micro.
No. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
An interesting thought for some future point is you were talking on Maru playing like 4M, with mines and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Where in the game, that aforementioned game against Sue, Flash just makes Hellbats.
Yeah.
And just A moves and gets smashed by bailing. So, you know, everyone has a different approach. You can be like Flash and make Hellbats, or be like Maru and make Widow Mines,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the final point I'm going to make is a very abstract one. I think there were basically more championship contenders in 2013 and 2014. And not only do I think there were more championship contenders, I think the depth of them means their depth was way higher back then than it was now. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, like, if you look at it now, like, even if you assume Maru is, like, some kind of weird anomaly and outlier, you can take him out if you want. The rest of the finals contenders you have, they're not as clearly as deep, in my opinion. You have Stats, Classic, Dark, really. Like, those are the 3 of them. And I think all 3 of them have proven, basically, they're kind of weak. Like, there's, like, some flaws in their play. Same thing with Innovation, if you want to include him. Like, basically, there's 4. Yeah. If you want to go to the 2013-2014 era, okay, let's go. Innovation, Sulky, Partying, Zest, Rain was in there, Life was in there, SOS was in there, that SOS back then was way better than the SOS now. Zest back then, way better than Zest now. Life doesn't even exist now. And Life is like literally the most talented player we've ever seen in StarCraft.
I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
So, because you talk about 2014, I think 2015 was even more like that. This is not.
2015 was even more like that. That's actually why Life, if somebody came out and said Life is the greatest of all time, like it's technically an argument.
Yeah. So you remember how SSL did like 16 person instead of 32?
Mm-hmm.
So season 3 of SSL in 2015, which is the last one in last one hardest form. You talk about contenders to win a tournament. And the round 16 was TY, Rogue, Classic, Hyun in one group. Brain, Myungsik, Dear Dream, Hero Innovation, Life SOS, BL Zest, Mario Staff. I think like half of that tournament, more than half of that could win a tournament.
More than half of that could win a GSL. Like it's ridiculous.
That's what I mean.
Right?
Yeah, it's amazing how competitive it was, how good everyone was, and now I think you touched on it. Everyone's getting towards lack of interest, age, whatever it is. I think there's a lot bigger discrepancy between the best guy, the 4th best guy, the 8th best guy. Before it used to be there were like 10 guys that could just win GSL that day if the tournament was a one-day tournament.
Yeah, and that's always been my thing. Like basically, the opponents were like, it's so abstract, but basically I think the opponents were so much harder back then, and the fact that Sue did it 4 times in a row in a meta that technically wasn't even good for him. Mm-hmm. Basically, like in my opinion, that's why he's still elevated above Maru and MVP. It's basically like the opponents were so goddamn hard back then.
Let me ask you a question. How many would Maru have to win in a row to tip the balance in your eyes?
It's not really how many, it's just who he plays against. Like here's how I'd put it. If he needs to win again, or here's how I think he'd have to convince me. It'd probably just have to be like one more, but it'd have to be a really legit one. Mm-hmm. So basically, if I had literally had to rig the format, I was like, okay, so round 1, go with somebody easy. You got to beat, I don't know, like SOS and Classic, and all right, so, and then round 2 you got to be like Dark and Rogue. Round 3 you got to be like Innovation.
Dark's job is losing along the way.
Basically, but this is the group stage. He's still good in the group stage. Okay. Then you gotta beat like Innovation or Sue in their prime. Then you gotta beat maybe fucking Stats again. Then you gotta beat a real winner in the fucking finals. I don't know who that exactly is, but basically that, like, if you do a legendary run like that, and people have done legendary runs like this, like MVP did one, Innovation did one, but then he lost the end to Sulky. Like, people have done legendary runs like this. If you do that, you can't really fuck with that at that point.
Yeah.
The other choice is the meta, for whatever reason, shifts so hard against Maru that he literally has to like pull out some kind of miracle shit.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. EDT, like every other turn, is losing to Protoss with Maru missing, which is a credit to Maru, but at a certain point, I mean, it is a credit to Maru, but the guy is just so much better than everyone else.
Yeah.
Like even when he loses to Stats, like he looked really good against Stats.
He looked like if we run it again, he might beat Stats.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's a 3-2 win, but yeah, I know what you mean. I think there's not much of a difference between winning 4 and winning 5. At a certain point, it's all just gratuitous, if you know what I mean. It's just, it's like that broke back emote on Twitch. It's like, 1, 3, then 4, then 5. Okay.
Like,
obviously, we've proven that no one's capable of beating him, so you might as well win 100
like,
at a certain point.
Like, here's the way he'd have to convince me is like the way LeBron has to convince himself, basically. Like, if you ever seen that, I don't know if you've seen it, but basically, like, for whatever reason, he's rewatching the NBA Finals from 2016, and he's like, see, this is the one that made me the GOAT. Like, that's basically the point. Like, you have to win.
The Warriors, right?
Yeah.
The Warriors?
Yeah, because you beat the Warriors. And that's basically the point, is if you want to be, like, the GOAT of anything, you have to win one where you're not supposed to win at all.
Got it.
Like, which one of these Maru runs has he done that he wasn't supposed to win at all? Like, I think he was supposed to win all of these. Right?
That's true. He needs 2013 Deer to show up.
Yeah, basically like that. If he won that, I'd be like, yeah, he is. He probably is, isn't he? Right? But that Deer doesn't exist anymore. So
I mean, I, GSL is free, but I'd pay to watch that.
Yeah. I'd love for that. That deer literally only exists within like a 3 month period. I can't believe like he literally showed up just to ruin Maru's career. But I guess you can say the same thing about Dream. Like that's literally what Dream did to life.
Let me tell you a real funny thing. So remember, like I think it was like a year ago, or whatever. There was the big discussion on Team Liquid about like who is the greatest of all time and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the Red Viper did this thing where he like assigned arbitrary. He thinks your method is hogwash.
Yeah.
Of figuring out the best player. So he assigned like points to everything. So he grouped all the tournaments, Codas, DreamHacks, MLGs, whatever, grouped them all together, assigned point values to placing, and Pro League also. And Maru actually got the most points for him. This was before Maru won any Codas.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But yeah, because of all the round of fours he made and all
he
the
is
really good.
He is so freakishly good. He was so freakishly good back then.
Yeah,
too.
I didn't realize this until I wrote the article. But yeah, Maru's made it to the round of 8 in Codas eight times. I mean, the round of 4, 8 times.
Like I've never been so like. It's so weird to say this, but he probably could have been the GOAT. It was either him or Life that should have taken it from MVP. But like both of them disappointed in different ways.
I know. But yeah, Maru he's made the round of 8 the most of any player 11 times, made the round of 4 the most times of any player 8, and now he's won the most of any player with 4. So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, Maru's fucking insane. Yeah,
we need Sue to beat Maru in a Codas final, and then we can really have this debate
again.
Yeah.
You know I'm already on Sue's side, but sure, we'll have it.
I might be on Sue's side if Sue beats him in a Codas final.
All right.
I think I would. You can quote me.
All right. So I think that about covers it for that particular argument. I think I covered all the points. Like basically, like Sue was in such a freakish era, in every conceivable way, that I still favor him even though he's never won one. But I guess like that's kind of like the conundrum with Sue, isn't he? He's so fucking good.
Yeah.
But but he's never really won one. He's always been like the hardest person to rank in that sense.
Yeah. I'll admit I wavered from Maru as we talked the whole thing out.
Fuck man, 11 championship. There's like 11 championship contenders back then. Here's the thing that'll really mess with your head. Basically, Sue beat Life in his prime. Maru never did.
Yeah.
Maru never did. Now imagine if Life still played, because this is the perfect era for Life, because you don't have to practice that much. He literally only has to like feel motivated, and he'll start stomping people. Yeah. But you don't get to play Life, so.
Yeah. Remember that the 2015 season I mentioned. The players that got eliminated in the round of 16 included Classic, Dream, Life, SOS, Maru, and Stats. The other people were Deer and Hyun, but they all got eliminated in the round of 16.
It's a fucking hard world out there, man. It was a fucking hard world out there.
Yeah, it was something else.
It's like, fuck. It was so fucking hard in 2014, 2015.
Now it's easy to make money.
Yeah, now it's much easier.
You win one tournament, you make like more money than you make in a year back then.
Yeah, this is also one of the weird reasons as to why like Teja is so high up for me still. It's because he technically beat all these guys in foreigner tournaments.
Yep.
But he's so weird. He's like another one of those weird guys who like forces you to like confront all the values you've ever held in StarCraft. Like. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that about covers it. I still even though like I understand like the point with Maru, and like I wouldn't even like be that angry about it if somebody's like, yeah, Maru's the best, MVP second, Sue is third, or whatever combination of those three you want to put up there, because I think the three of them like are far surpass anybody else basically. If we're just talking purely about the GSL, now if we're talking about the GOAT, it's a bit different. But for the GSL, those three surpass everybody else, and so like that's kind of. But I still think it's Sue. I still think.
Okay.
I still think it's him.
I buy it.
Yeah.
I buy it.
All right. Think about covers it. See you guys later.